We're taught that early humans were weak, barely surviving the brutal gauntlet of the Ice Age, surrounded by predators sharper, faster, and stronger than anything we can imagine. And yet, 300,000 years ago, in what is now Germany, someone carved a wooden spear so perfectly balanced it rivals modern Olympic javelins. It was buried in a peat swamp alongside the skeletons of 20 horses, many of them showing signs of organized butchery. This wasn't the work of fragile survivors picking at leftovers. This was the kill site of a team of hunters who knew exactly what they were doing. The place is called Schöningen, located near an open-cast lignite mine in Lower Saxony. In 1995, archaeologist Hartmut Thieme made the discovery while overseeing a dig meant for industrial clearance. What he unearthed shocked the scientific community. 8 wooden spears, some nearly 8 feet long, carved from spruce trunks with aerodynamic precision. They were double-pointed, carefully shaved, and shaped so that their center of gravity rested in the front third of the shaft, exactly where it should be for a high-velocity throwing weapon. These weren't makeshift sticks. These were purpose-built, high-performance tools, and they predated the bow and arrow by more than 200,000 years. Conventional models of human development couldn't explain this. We weren't supposed to be capable of this kind of technology at the time. There was no writing, no metallurgy, no measuring tools. Yet somehow, these people understood weight distribution, shaft stabilization, and terminal velocity long before Newton, long before calculus, long before the concept of physics itself existed. What makes the Schöningen site even more baffling are 3 specific features that challenge everything we thought we knew.
Real quick, if stories of forgotten history intrigues you, consider subscribing for more. Now, let's keep digging.
First, these weren't isolated finds. The spears were discovered with butchered horse bones, some of which showed signs of marrow extraction and joint disarticulation, behaviors associated with skilled hunting. Second, these weapons were not experimental. All 8 spears found were fully functional and aerodynamically refined, with no evidence of learning curve mistakes or discarded prototypes. Third, analysis of their impact force revealed a striking fact. Thrown correctly, these spears could penetrate the flesh of a large mammal at over 15 meters, a feat that even modern survivalists struggle to replicate. So here's the mystery. If humans didn't yet have fire, formal language, or even permanent settlements, how did they manage to engineer something so deadly, so elegant, and so effective? Where did this knowledge come from? Who taught them to kill like this? And more importantly, was this an isolated event, or part of a much larger, much darker pattern? What we're about to uncover in this video will challenge everything you've been taught about the origins of humanity. Because the Schöningen spears are not an exception, they are the beginning of a terrifying story. From Germany to Spain, from Kenya to Turkey, the archaeological record reveals a species that didn't just survive, it hunted with precision, killed its own kind, and may have practiced cannibalistic rituals for tens of thousands of years before writing ever existed. These were not fragile survivors. These were apex predators, armed with intellect, hunger, and memory. By the end of this video, you'll understand why mainstream anthropology still struggles to explain these discoveries. You'll see the 3 most compelling theories that might explain how this level of cognitive and technological sophistication emerged so early, and why some researchers believe we've buried part of the truth about who we really are. So before we move on, ask yourself this. If humans were once prey, why does the fossil record tell a story of precision kills, cracked skulls, and perfectly shaped weapons? What happened in those forgotten millennia that turned us into the planet's most dangerous animal? For decades, the dominant theory in anthropology told a very different story. According to the textbooks, early humans were timid opportunists, scavengers who hovered at the edge of predator kills, hoping to sneak in a meal once the lions had eaten their fill. It was a theory backed by some of the biggest names in the field. In the 1970s, archaeologist Louis Binford studied bones from Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania and found what looked like carnivore tooth marks underneath human-made cut marks. His conclusion? We weren't the killers. We were the cleanup crew. This idea became gospel in classrooms for decades. It reinforced a vision of our ancestors as cautious, slow, and clever only in their ability to survive by avoiding confrontation. The story was comforting in a way. Our rise wasn't based on violence or bloodshed. It was based on intelligence, cooperation, and endurance. But that theory didn't age well, because then came box growth. In the 1990s, on the southern coast of England, archaeologist Mark Roberts led excavations at a site called Boxgrove Quarry. What his team uncovered would force a total reassessment of early human behavior. They found the fossilized scapula of a wild horse, nearly 500,000 years old, and in it, a hole. But not just any hole. It was a deep, round puncture wound, about the diameter of a sharpened wooden spear. It didn't match any known predator's bite. There were no crushing fractures, no claw marks, no signs of scavenger activity. Just a clean, focused strike, like a deliberate thrust from a short-range weapon. Later, ballistic reconstructions revealed that the spear would have needed to hit with over 150 joules of force to penetrate that deeply. That's the equivalent of a modern javelin, except this one wasn't designed in a lab. It was made with stone tools, by hand, 500,000 years ago. If humans at that time weren't supposed to have projectile weapons, if they were still learning to hunt, then how do we explain this kill? Some researchers tried to dismiss it. They said it might have been a fluke. Maybe the animal fell on a pointed branch, but the site said otherwise. Surrounding the horse remains were dozens of flint tools, some stained with blood residue. There were butchery marks along the limbs, joints cleanly separated for easier transport. This wasn't an accident. This was an industrial butchery site. And it wasn't just Boxgrove. At the same time, similar findings were beginning to emerge from Germany, France, and Spain. Sites with weapons, wounds, and evidence of kills that suggested planning, coordination, and lethal force. And yet, the scavenger-first narrative hung on, more by inertia than by evidence. Professor Roberts himself put it bluntly, the physics don't lie. This wasn't an opportunistic act. This was a calculated kill. So what are we left with? We're left with a species that supposedly didn't have language, metallurgy, or advanced tools, but could build spears capable of penetrating horsebone, bone, coordinate ambushes, and process carcasses with anatomical precision. At this point, we have to ask a stronger question. If early humans were truly nothing more than scavengers, how do we explain a kill site this advanced, with weapons this lethal, and no signs of predator assistance? And if humans were already hunting prey this large, this early, could it be that we weren't just killing animals? Could we have turned that same precision, that same predatory instinct, on each other? Because what came next in the fossil record wasn't an animal kill, it was a human one. And what we found there challenges everything we thought we knew. Not just about survival, but about what it means to be human at all. In 1994, deep inside a cave in northern Spain, a team of archaeologists made a discovery that still haunts the field of human evolution. The cave, part of the Atapuerca site, was called Gran Dolina. The layer in question was labeled TD6. What they found inside wasn't just unexpected, it was horrifying. Buried within the reddish sediments were over 170 fragments of human bone, many belonging to children as young as 6. But these weren't graves. There were no burials, no signs of mourning. The bones were broken, scraped, and carved with disturbing precision. Under magnification, the pattern was unmistakable. Cut marks along the jaw lines, around the eye sockets, and across the joints. Percussion fractures along the long bones, especially femurs and tibiae. And on several fragments, tooth scoring, matching the spacing of human teeth. In short, the remains had been butchered, just like the deer and bison bones found in the same layer. According to lead excavators José Bermúdez de Castro, Eudald Carbonell, and Juan Luis Arzuaga, this wasn't a massacre or a burial, this was dinner. Radiometric dating and paleomagnetic analysis placed the layer at roughly 800,000 years ago. That makes it the earliest direct evidence of human-on-human cannibalism in the world. And it wasn't chaotic. It was methodical. According to taphonomic studies, more than 30% of the human bones from TD6 showed clear signs of defleshing, marrow extraction, and deliberate breakage while the bone was still fresh. That level of processing is only seen when the goal is caloric return. In other words, this wasn't ritual, it was nutrition. But the implications go far deeper than just hunger, because the people doing this were Homo antecessor, an early human ancestor with a brain roughly 75% the size of ours. They weren't scavengers, they weren't Neanderthals. They were one of us, and they were eating each other like prey. The researchers proposed that this was a form of paleoeconomic behavior, not an act of desperation or disease, but a practiced, perhaps even strategic behavior. They targeted the young, possibly because children were easier to capture and offered fewer social consequences. And they didn't just consume flesh. They broke open skulls for brains, split long bones for marrow, and left behind the kind of signature that forensic anthropologists associate with butchers, not brutes. This alone would be enough to shake the foundations of our assumptions about early humanity. But the trail doesn't stop there. Fast forward 785,000 years to Gough's Cave in Somerset, England. Discovered during rescue excavations in the late 1980s, Gough's Cave produced a different kind of horror. There, archaeologists uncovered the remains of at least 5 individuals, 2 adults, 2 adolescents, and a child. The bones were broken, processed, and, most disturbingly, modified. 3 skulls had been carefully defleshed, the lower jaws removed, and the cranial vaults reshaped into cups. The edges were smoothed with a tool. Microscopic analysis published in 2011 by Sylvia Bello and colleagues showed that the retouching techniques used on the skulls mirrored the same methods used to shape flint blades. In other words, they didn't just eat the people. They turned their heads into drinking vessels, thousands of years before writing, agriculture, or cities. This wasn't a brief period of desperation. It was part of a cultural tradition. And just like at Atapuerca, the people doing it weren't savage outliers. They were Magdalenian, Ice Age hunter-gatherers known for advanced art, tool-making, and complex social systems. They painted caves. They buried their dead. And sometimes, they drank from their skulls. So what does this mean? It means the notion of civilization as a shield against brutality might be backwards. That before we ever wrote our names or built walls around our cities, we had already developed a capacity for symbolic violence that would rival any later empire. It means ritual, memory, and predation didn't follow intelligence. They were part of it. And the pattern continues. In France, at Moulin-Guercy, 6 Neanderthal individuals were butchered in exactly the same manner, right down to the disarticulation techniques. In Belgium, at Goyet Caves, Neanderthal bones were carved into retouchers, tools used to sharpen other tools. In Kenya, at Nataruk, 27 humans, including pregnant women and children, were massacred and left where they fell, their hands bound and obsidian blades still embedded in their bones. This isn't isolated, this is global, this is cross-species. This is behavior so deeply embedded in our past that it shows up in multiple timelines, multiple regions, and multiple forms. Sometimes it was hunger, sometimes it was war, sometimes it was ritual, but it was never random. And here's where the story turns. Because up until now, you've been told that intelligence made us human, that tools, language, and fire were our great leap forward. But what if the real driver wasn't survival, but predation? What if the thing that set us apart wasn't kindness, or cooperation, or community, but the memory of the hunt? The evidence is clear. Early humans weren't just scavenging scraps. They were engineering weapons, stalking prey, eating their own, and turning the act of killing into something remembered, repeated, and eventually ritualized. Now we can begin to see how the bones from Atapuerca, the skulls from Gough's Cave, and the weapons from Schoningen all fit into a larger pattern. A story that's not about how we survived despite being fragile, but how we survived because we were terrifying. And yet, despite all of this, we still don't know why. Why did they carve skulls into cups and then stop? Why do these behaviors appear across continents without any written connection? Why does the violence seem so precise, so early, and then vanish for millennia? Because now we've reached the part of the story where facts aren't enough. The bones speak, but the meaning? That's where things get strange. The bones speak clearly of butchery, cannibalism, and carefully executed violence. But the meaning behind those acts remains murky. Archaeologists don't dig up motivations. They dig up marks on femurs, teeth scores on skulls, and skulls shaped into drinking vessels. And from those fragments, they build stories. Some theories are grimly logical. Others are disturbingly poetic. All are incomplete. The first and most widely accepted theory is nutritional cannibalism. This interpretation sees the evidence, cut marks, bone breakage, marrow extraction, as practical. Humans were starving. They did what they had to do. food is food, especially when calories are scarce. Homo antecessor at Atapuerca was living in an Ice Age Europe with predators at every corner. Conspecifics, other humans, were simply another meat source. In this view, cannibalism is survival. Brutal but rational, and it makes sense until it doesn't. Because many of these sites, like Guff's Cave, show signs of seasonal abundance. The Magdalenian hunters weren't starving. They had fresh red deer, wild horses, bison. The human remains were processed alongside animal remains, but not instead of them. And the extra steps, like reshaping skulls into cups, suggest intent that goes far beyond hunger. This leads to the second theory, mortuary ritualism. This idea reframes cannibalism not as consumption, but as reverence. In this view, processing the body is part of the funeral. Flesh is removed not to eat, but to separate body from soul. Bones are broken not for marrow, but to release the spirit. Drinking from the skull, a gesture of remembrance. There are ethnographic parallels here. In parts of Papua New Guinea, some tribes practiced endo-cannibalism, consuming the dead to absorb their essence. In Tibet, sky burials leave the body to vultures. Death, in many cultures, is not the end, but a transition. But this theory hits a wall at Atapuerca. The victims there were overwhelmingly children. There's no evidence they were related to the cannibals, and the bones were discarded with animal refuse, not treated with care. The processing was efficient, not ceremonial. This doesn't look like ritual, it looks like slaughter. Which brings us to a darker interpretation: warfare cannibalism. Some researchers suggest that early human groups saw outsiders not just as enemies, but as resources. Captured individuals weren't just killed, they were eaten. Their remains were used as tools, trophies, warnings. This theory is supported by the clustered ages of victims, selective targeting, and the absence of healing on bones, suggesting rapid execution post-capture. But again, this assumes coordination, strategy, communication, planning. That level of social cohesion is debated for species like Homo antecessor or early Neanderthals. Warfare requires hierarchy, leadership, and there's no direct evidence of such complexity in the lower Paleolithic record. So a fourth theory emerges, one that doesn't assume survival, ritual, or war, just behavior, cold, instinctive behavior, territorial elimination. This theory, rarely discussed in public, suggests that early humans may have engaged in intra-species culling, not for food, not for ceremony, but simply to remove competitors, kill them, eat them, leave no trace. The remains at TD6 show signs of repeated behaviors across multiple individuals. Some were infants, some adolescents, few adults. It's as if certain humans were deemed outside the reproductive or social group and removed. It's not far from what chimpanzees do during territorial disputes. Only here, the remains were processed. But then, why process them like prey? Why use the same tools for butchering deer and dismembering a child? There's a final theory, fringe, but not baseless. It's called neurochemical ritualism. This idea suggests early humans discovered, intentionally or not, that consuming human brain tissue or organ meat could induce altered states. Certain organs, especially liver and brain, contain compounds that affect neurotransmitter activity. Consuming them fresh may have caused dissociative or hallucinogenic effects. Could this have become part of a proto-shamanic tradition? There's no direct evidence for this, no chemical residues, but the idea of ritualized transformation via flesh shows up in cultures thousands of years later. Aztec priests consumed the hearts of the sacrificed. Siberian shamans used psychoactive mushrooms. The overlap between killing and transformation is ancient and unsettling. None of these theories fully explain what we've seen. Some bones look like food, some look like offerings, some like trophies. And perhaps that's the answer. It wasn't one reason, it was many. Hunger, power, fear, reverence, survival. These behaviors didn't come after civilization, they were civilization. And here's where the timeline fractures. Because right as cannibalism becomes widespread, it disappears. Around 10,000 years ago, as agriculture spreads and cities emerge, the direct evidence of human cannibalism begins to vanish. Not completely, but it becomes rare, hidden, or transformed. Did we suppress it? Replace it with symbolic substitutes, blood rituals, animal sacrifice, communion bread? Or did we simply forget? That memory buried in our bones now only echoes in nightmares and myth. So what's truly at stake here? If we accept that early humans were predators, not just of animals, but of each other, then everything changes. Civilization isn't the birth of humanity, it's the leash we built to contain it. All our myths about monsters, witches, blood drinkers, they may not be fantasies, they may be memories. Memories of a time when humans weren't prey, but something far worse, because the timeline still doesn't make sense. The behaviors are ancient, the techniques refined, but they appear fully formed in scattered places without clear origin, which raises one final disturbing question. Who taught them? For centuries, we've told the story of early humans as if it began with firelight, cooperation, community, family. We imagine them as fragile wanderers clinging to life in a brutal world. But what if the opposite was true? What if the world clung to life while they hunted it down? What if the first humans weren't prey, but something closer to a predator god? All across the globe, we find echoes of the same terrifying pattern. In the caves of Spain, Britain, France, and Croatia, in the highlands of China and the open savannas of Africa, bones split with precision, skulls flayed and sculpted, children reduced to trophies. Entire family groups vanished, consumed by their own species. This wasn't isolated, this was humanity's blueprint. And it doesn't end with the Paleolithic. Take the archaeological record of Çatalhöyük, one of the world's oldest cities, dating to 7,100 BCE. The dead weren't buried far away. They were entombed under the floors of homes, beneath beds and hearths, sometimes painted with red ochre or rearticulated in unnatural poses. These weren't graves, they were shrines. Sometimes the bones were missing flesh. Or consider the victims of moche sacrifice in ancient Peru, children whose blood was offered to mountains, warriors whose hearts were ripped out and whose bodies were consumed by their enemies in ritual combat. It's not a primitive impulse we left behind, it's a current running beneath every civilization, an echo from something older than memory. They're the psychological scars of a species that once ate itself to survive, and maybe to evolve. But we still haven't answered the question that haunts this entire mystery. Why does it appear so suddenly, so consistently, in such distant places, all at once? And here, we turn to the most compelling integrated theory, one that combines biology, culture, and environment into a single model, the evolutionary predation spiral. The theory goes like this. As early humans gained tool use and cooperative hunting skills, their primary threat became themselves, other humans. No predator was more dangerous than the ones who shared your mind, your terrain, your hunger. So evolution pushed aggression inward. It shaped us not just to kill prey, but to manipulate, deceive, dominate, and, when necessary, eliminate rival groups, not out of malice, but out of reproductive logic. The more effective your group was at wiping out others, the more territory you controlled, the more meat, the more mates, the more children. And so, the brain evolved around not just cooperation, but suppression. The worst behaviors, cannibalism, sacrifice, infanticide, weren't bugs. They were features, engines of survival. And then, like a switch flipped, something changed. The same behaviors that helped us survive became liabilities. Cooperation scaled beyond kin, language developed, stories spread, agriculture demanded stability, and suddenly the monsters we had been, the eaters of kin, the butchers of children, became threats to the new order. So we buried them deep in myth, buried them beneath churches and temples, buried them beneath morality. But bones don't forget. That's why this matters. This isn't just about what early humans did. It's about what we still carry inside us. The violence, the rituals, the need for myth. If we don't face it, truly face it, we risk misunderstanding ourselves again. Because the scariest thing about cannibalism isn't the gore, it's the logic. And the worst atrocities in history weren't ancient. They were modern, industrial, sanitized. The Holocaust, Rwanda, Cambodia. These weren't acts of madness. They were humans, following orders, optimizing systems, just like before. Only now the tools were sharper, the myths more sophisticated, the rituals encoded in uniforms, chants, and paperwork. We never stopped being terrifying. We just got better at pretending we weren't. But there's hope in that too, because the fact that we're horrified by our past means something has shifted. The rituals no longer hold, the myths no longer sedate. We dig up the bones not to worship, but to understand. And that might be the first, truly human thing we've ever done. So here's the final question. If early humans were terrifying, and we are their descendants, what parts of them still live in us? What instincts do we suppress without understanding? And what would happen if something brought them back to the surface? Thanks for watching. If you want more forgotten discoveries and real mysteries from deep history, subscribe and turn on notifications. Until next time, keep questioning everything.